The book of Exodus is one of the most profound and transformative texts in the Bible. It tells the story of God's power, justice, and mercy as He delivers His people from slavery and establishes a covenant that would define their identity for generations to come. But Exodus is more than an ancient narrative. It is a blueprint for faith, a call to obedience, and a testament to the enduring presence of God in the lives of His people. In today's exploration, we will journey through the core messages of this incredible book. We'll reflect on its key moments, from the cries of a suffering people in Egypt to the thunderous revelation of God's law at Mount Sinai, from the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea to the intricate details of the Tabernacle, where God's presence dwells among His chosen nation. Each part of Exodus reveals timeless lessons on deliverance, worship, and the transformative power of divine guidance. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. If you find today's video meaningful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need encouragement. Let's grow together as we explore the timeless truths of the Bible. Now, let us open the book of Exodus and step into a story that continues to inspire faith, courage, and hope across the ages. Part 1: The Cry of a Suffering People and God's Call to Deliverance. The book of Exodus begins with a dramatic and somber tone, painting a vivid picture of the Israelites' plight in Egypt. After the death of Joseph and his generation, the once favored descendants of Israel face an era of oppression under a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Exodus 1 verse 8. This shift marks the beginning of their suffering as Pharaoh, fearing their growing numbers and strength, imposes harsh labor and even decrees the death of all newborn Hebrew boys. The oppression serves as the backdrop for one of the most critical themes of Exodus: God's response to human suffering. The cries of the Israelites rise to God, and their pain is not ignored. The Bible explicitly states, God heard their groaning, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Exodus 2 verses 24 to 25. This passage highlights a key aspect of God's character: His faithfulness to His promises and His compassion for His people. Amid this suffering, the narrative introduces Moses, a man whose life is intertwined with God's plan for deliverance. Born during Pharaoh's decree to kill all Hebrew male infants, Moses' survival is nothing short of miraculous. His mother places him in a basket and sets him afloat on the Nile, where Pharaoh's daughter finds and adopts him. Moses' upbringing in Pharaoh's household positions him uniquely as a bridge between the Israelites and the Egyptians, though he is yet unaware of his divine calling. The turning point in Moses' story, and indeed the beginning of God's deliverance plan, occurs in the wilderness of Midian. After fleeing Egypt for killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave, Moses spends years in exile as a shepherd. It is here, in the quiet of the desert, that he encounters the extraordinary, a bush that burns but is not consumed. Through this burning bush, God reveals Himself and calls Moses to lead His people out of slavery. God's words to Moses are profound. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Exodus 3 verses 7 to 8. This declaration encapsulates the heart of God's mission in Exodus. He is a God who sees, hears, and acts. His concern is not passive. It moves Him to intervene in human history to fulfill His promises and restore His people. Moses, however, is reluctant. His initial responses to God's call reveal a man burdened by self-doubt and fear. He questions his worthiness, saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3 verse 11. He worries about his ability to convince the Israelites and even about his speaking abilities. Yet, God's patience and assurance shine through. God promises His presence, saying, "I will be with you." Exodus 3 verse 12. and provides Moses with signs and Aaron as a spokesperson. This section of Exodus sets the stage for the grand narrative of deliverance. It reveals key truths about God's character, His awareness of human suffering, His faithfulness to His covenant, and His commitment to empowering flawed and hesitant individuals to fulfill His divine purposes. It also introduces Moses as a reluctant but chosen leader whose obedience to God's call will lead to one of the most extraordinary acts of liberation in biblical history. In many ways, the opening chapters of Exodus resonate deeply with readers today. They remind us that God is not distant from our struggles. Like the Israelites, we may feel overwhelmed by the pharaohs in our lives, oppression, fear, or doubt. But Exodus teaches us that God is always listening, always working, and always faithful to His promises. His call to Moses is a reminder that He often uses the unlikely and the imperfect to achieve His purposes, reassuring us that when God calls, He equips. As we move forward in Exodus, the themes of God's presence and power will unfold even further, revealing a God who is not only faithful to deliver, but also desires to dwell among His people. Part 2. God's power revealed through the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues that God brought upon Egypt in the book of Exodus are a profound narrative of His power and His faithfulness to His people. Each plague was not merely an act of divine punishment, but a deliberate and strategic demonstration of God's authority over the false gods of Egypt, Pharaoh's arrogance, and the natural order. As the Israelites cried out under the weight of their enslavement, these plagues paved the way for their liberation, exposing the frailty of human pride and the strength of divine will. The first plague set the tone for what was to come. The Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, was turned into blood. This event was not just catastrophic, but deeply symbolic. The Nile, revered as sacred and the source of life, was shown to be under God's control. Fish perished, the waters stank, and the Egyptians were left scrambling to find drinkable water elsewhere. Pharaoh's magicians attempted to replicate this, but their efforts only hardened his heart further, showcasing the futility of human imitation in the face of divine power. The second plague, the frogs, followed closely, swarming over Egypt and invading every corner of daily life. Frogs were sacred in Egyptian culture, associated with the goddess Hecate, a symbol of fertility and life. Yet their overwhelming presence turned from blessing to curse, as Pharaoh's magicians again imitated the miracle without offering relief. It was Moses' plea to God that finally ended the plague, leaving the land reeking of dead frogs, a grim reminder of the consequences of Pharaoh's defiance. Then came gnats, an infestation that Pharaoh's magicians could not replicate, forcing them to admit, "This is the finger of God," Exodus 8 verse 19. The gnats disrupted the very soil of Egypt, symbolizing a direct challenge to the god Geb, who was believed to govern the earth. Despite this acknowledgement from his own advisors, Pharaoh's heart grew more resistant. The fourth plague, swarms of flies, intensified the misery, targeting the homes and livestock of the Egyptians, but sparing the Israelites. This marked the first instance of God making a distinction between His people and the Egyptians, emphasizing His protection over those who followed Him. The fifth plague struck directly at Egypt's wealth and livelihood as a deadly pestilence swept through their livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep, all essential to Egypt's economy and daily life, were decimated. This plague attacked multiple Egyptian deities associated with animals and agriculture, such as Atha and Apis, exposing their inability to protect the very domains they supposedly controlled. Again, the Israelites' livestock was spared, highlighting God's provision and favor for His chosen people. The sixth plague brought boils upon the Egyptians, afflicting both people and animals with painful sores. Even Pharaoh's magicians, once confident in their abilities, could not stand before Moses because they were covered in the same affliction. This plague demonstrated God's control over health and physical well-being, confronting the Egyptian gods of medicine and healing, such as Imhotep. Still, Pharaoh refused to relent, his pride outweighing the suffering of his people. Hailstorm came next, a devastating natural disaster that destroyed crops, trees, and livestock left in the open. God warned Pharaoh through Moses to take shelter, showing his mercy even amidst judgment. Yet many Egyptians ignored the warning, and their disobedience resulted in catastrophic loss. The hailstorm, accompanied by thunder and fire, demonstrated God's absolute power over the skies and nature, challenging gods like Nut, the sky goddess, and Osiris, associated with agriculture. Pharaoh momentarily admitted his sin, but quickly reneged on his promise to let the Israelites go, revealing the depth of his stubbornness. The eighth plague, locusts, swept over the land, consuming what little remained after the hail. These creatures symbolized total devastation, as they left no grain or vegetation untouched. Pharaoh's officials, recognizing the destruction, pleaded with him to relent, saying, "Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Exodus 10 verse 7. Yet Pharaoh's partial concession, to let only the men go, fell short of God's demand for full liberation, prolonging Egypt's suffering. The penultimate plague, darkness, was one of profound spiritual significance. For 3 days, an oppressive darkness covered the land of Egypt, so thick that it could be felt. This was a direct attack on Ra, the sun god and one of Egypt's most revered deities. By plunging the land into darkness, God demonstrated his supremacy over even the highest of Egypt's gods. While the Egyptians were immobilized by this eerie blackness, the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings, a striking contrast that underscored God's favor. The final and most devastating plague, the death of the firstborn, broke Pharaoh's resistance. God's warning was clear: every firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's own son to the lowliest servant, would die unless protected by the blood of a lamb. The Israelites, obeying God's instructions, marked their doorposts with lamb's blood, and the angel of death passed over their homes. This act of faith and obedience became the foundation of the Passover, a celebration of God's deliverance that endures to this day. For Egypt, this was the ultimate judgment, striking at the heart of its future and at Pharaoh's supposed divinity. When the final plague struck, Pharaoh finally relented, ordering the Israelites to leave Egypt immediately. Yet their departure was not one of desperation but triumph. The Egyptians, eager to see them go, gave them gold, silver, and clothing, fulfilling God's promise that his people would leave with great wealth. The 10 plagues, from the Nile turning to blood to the death of the firstborn, showcased God's justice, mercy, and sovereignty, preparing the Israelites for the journey to freedom. This narrative is not just a story of divine power, it is a testament to God's covenant faithfulness. The plagues remind us that no force, human, natural, or spiritual, can stand against the Lord. For the Israelites, it was a call to trust and obedience, a reminder that deliverance comes not by human strength, but by God's hand. And for us today, the 10 plagues stand as a powerful symbol of God's unchanging character, his justice in confronting evil, and his mercy in providing a way of salvation. Part 3. The Exodus and Crossing the Red Sea. The culmination of God's plan for the Israelites comes in the form of a miraculous deliverance, the Exodus. This defining moment is not merely an escape from Egypt, but a complete transformation. A people once enslaved are now freed, not by their own strength, but by the outstretched hand of God. This event, filled with both awe and significance, reveals God's power, his covenant faithfulness, and his call for his people to trust him wholeheartedly. As Pharaoh finally succumbs to the devastation of the 10th plague, he orders Moses and Aaron to take the Israelites and leave Egypt. His words, "Go, worship the Lord as you have requested," Exodus 12 verse 31, mark the moment of liberation. The Israelites, numbering around 600,000 men plus women and children, begin their journey out of the land where they had suffered for over 4 centuries. They leave not as refugees but as victors, carrying with them silver, gold, and clothing given to them by the Egyptians, fulfilling God's earlier promise, "You will plunder the Egyptians," Exodus 3 verse 22. This departure is marked by obedience and divine provision. The Israelites are instructed to celebrate the Passover annually as a remembrance of their deliverance, a ritual that reinforces their identity as God's chosen people. The unleavened bread they carry symbolizes the haste of their departure, a reminder that when God moves, there is no time for delay. The pillar of cloud by day and fire by night that accompanies them is a visible sign of God's presence and guidance, offering assurance that they are not alone. However, the journey out of Egypt quickly turns into a test of faith. Pharaoh, overcome by regret and rage, musters his army and sets out to reclaim his former slaves. The sight of Pharaoh's chariots approaching strikes fear into the hearts of the Israelites. They cry out to Moses, accusing him of leading them to certain death. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? Exodus 14 verse 11. This moment of panic reveals their lingering doubts and their struggle to fully trust in God's power and plan. Moses' response, however, is one of unwavering faith. He declares, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14 verse 13. God then commands Moses to raise his staff over the Red Sea, and the waters part, creating a dry path for the Israelites to cross. This miraculous act, unparalleled in its scale and significance, is both a physical deliverance and a spiritual affirmation. The Israelites walk through the sea with walls of water on either side, a vivid symbol of God's power to make a way where none exists. As the Israelites reach the other side, Pharaoh's army pursues them into the parted sea. But when Moses stretches out his hand again, the waters return, engulfing the Egyptian soldiers and their chariots. Not one of them survives. This moment is not just a military victory, but a divine judgment against Egypt's oppression, a demonstration that no force on earth can withstand the will of the Almighty. The Israelites witness this act of salvation, and their response is profound. When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. Exodus 14 verse 31. The crossing of the Red Sea is a turning point, not only in the narrative of Exodus, but in the spiritual journey of the Israelites. It is here that their identity as a liberated people begins to take shape. No longer are they slaves defined by their oppression. They are now a nation chosen and redeemed by God, called to trust him as they move toward the promised land. Yet, the challenges they face in the wilderness will test the depth of their faith and their willingness to obey. This event also carries profound theological significance. The Exodus is a foreshadowing of the ultimate deliverance through Christ, who leads his followers from the bondage of sin to the freedom of salvation. The Red Sea becomes a symbol of baptism, where believers pass through the waters into new life, leaving behind the chains of their old existence. Just as the Israelites' deliverance required faith and obedience, so too does the journey of faith demand trust in God's power to save and sustain. As the Israelites sing a song of praise to the Lord after their crossing, their words capture the essence of this transformative moment. The Lord is my strength and my defense, he has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. Exodus 15 verse 2. This song, known as the Song of the Sea, is both a celebration of God's victory and a declaration of their dependence on him. The Exodus is not just a historical event, but a timeless testimony to God's character. It reveals a God who hears the cries of the oppressed, who acts decisively to bring justice, and who walks with his people through every trial. For the Israelites, it is the beginning of a journey toward understanding what it means to live as a free and holy nation under God's guidance. For us today, it is a reminder that God is faithful to his promises, that his power is unmatched, and that his deliverance is available to all who trust in him. The story of the Exodus continues to resonate, calling us to step forward in faith, trusting that the same God who parted the Red Sea is still at work in our lives. Part 4. The Covenant at Mount Sinai. After the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea and their liberation from Egypt, the Israelites' journey brings them to Mount Sinai, where one of the most profound events in biblical history unfolds. At this sacred mountain, God establishes a covenant with his people, transforming a group of former slaves into a holy nation under his guidance. This covenant is not just a legal agreement, but a spiritual commitment that defines Israel's identity and relationship with God for generations to come. The arrival at Mount Sinai is marked by God's dramatic manifestation. The mountain is shrouded in smoke, fire, and thunder, and the ground trembles as God's presence descends upon it. This awe-inspiring display serves as a reminder of God's holiness and power, setting the stage for the solemnity of the covenant that is about to be established. The Israelites, standing at the foot of the mountain, are instructed to consecrate themselves, for they are about to encounter the living God. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Exodus 19 verse 16. This moment underscores the gravity of the encounter. It is not just a meeting, but a divine revelation that will shape the destiny of an entire nation. At the heart of this covenant are the 10 Commandments, delivered by God himself. These commandments are far more than rules. They are a moral and spiritual foundation for the Israelites, calling them to live in a way that reflects God's character and holiness. The first 4 commandments focus on the Israelites' relationship with God, emphasizing worship, reverence, and the exclusivity of their devotion to him. "You shall have no other gods before me," Exodus 20 verse 3, is a direct reminder of their deliverance from Egypt, where false gods abounded. The remaining 6 commandments govern interpersonal relationships, promoting justice, respect, and community harmony. Together, these laws are a blueprint for a society that reflects God's kingdom on earth. However, the covenant at Sinai extends beyond the 10 commandments. God provides Moses with detailed instructions for building the Tabernacle, a portable sanctuary that will serve as the dwelling place of his presence among his people. This is a significant moment, as it represents God's desire to be intimately involved in the lives of his people. The tabernacle is to be constructed with the finest materials, symbolizing the sacredness of God's presence. Every element, from the Ark of the Covenant to the altar of incense, is imbued with spiritual significance, pointing to God's holiness and the necessity of proper worship. The Israelites' response to the covenant is initially one of agreement and reverence. They declare, "We will do everything the Lord has said, we will obey," Exodus 24 verse 7. This willingness to commit to God's commands reflects their recognition of his sovereignty and their gratitude for his deliverance. However, as the narrative unfolds, their resolve will be tested, revealing the complexities of their faith and obedience. One of the most striking aspects of the Sinai covenant is the way it highlights God's grace. The laws and commandments given at Sinai are not prerequisites for salvation, but a response to it. God has already redeemed the Israelites from Egypt. The covenant is a means of guiding them to live in a manner worthy of their calling as his chosen people. This dynamic of grace first, then obedience, underscores the relational nature of God's covenant with his people. Yet, even amidst this monumental moment, human frailty emerges. While Moses is on the mountain receiving the law, the Israelites, in their impatience, construct a golden calf and proclaim it as their god. This act of idolatry is a stark contrast to the covenant they had just agreed to, highlighting their struggle to fully trust in an unseen God. When Moses descends and sees the golden calf, his anger burns, and he breaks the stone tablets, symbolizing the broken covenant. God's response, however, is one of both justice and mercy. He punishes those who rebelled, but reaffirms his commitment to his people, commanding Moses to chisel new tablets and renew the covenant. The covenant at Mount Sinai is not just a historical event, but a profound theological moment. It reveals God's desire for a relationship with his people, a relationship that is not based on fear, but on love, obedience, and mutual commitment. The giving of the law shows that God is not only concerned with spiritual matters, but also with the practical aspects of daily life, calling his people to live in a way that honors him and blesses others. For the Israelites, the covenant serves as a constant reminder of who they are and whose they are. It calls them to be a holy nation, set apart from the surrounding cultures, and to reflect God's character in their worship, relationships, and community life. For modern readers, the Sinai covenant points to a God who is not distant but deeply involved in the lives of his people, a God who calls us to live in a way that mirrors his holiness and love. The events at Mount Sinai resonate across generations, reminding us of the transformative power of encountering God. They challenge us to examine our own commitment to his commands and to live as people who are set apart for his purposes. Just as the Israelites were called to be a light to the nations, so too are we called to reflect God's glory in every aspect of our lives. The covenant at Sinai is not just a story of the past, it is a living testament to a God who desires to dwell among his people and guide them into a life of faithfulness, holiness, and purpose. Part 5. The Tabernacle and God's Presence. The final movement in the book of Exodus is the detailed account of the construction of the tabernacle, a sacred space where God would dwell among his people. This section not only marks the culmination of the Israelites' journey from slavery to freedom, but also signifies the establishment of an intimate relationship between God and his chosen nation. The tabernacle represents more than a physical structure, it is a profound theological statement about God's desire to be present with his people, his holiness, and the proper way to worship him. After the covenant at Mount Sinai, God provides Moses with specific instructions for building the tabernacle. These instructions, recorded in Exodus 25-31, are meticulous and deliberate, emphasizing the sacredness of this dwelling place. God declares, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." Exodus 25 verses 8-9. This directive highlights the central theme of God's presence. Unlike the distant deities of other ancient cultures, the God of Israel chooses to dwell in the midst of his people, symbolizing his closeness and accessibility. The materials for the tabernacle, gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, acacia wood, and precious stones, are to be brought as free-will offerings from the Israelites. These materials, many of which were given to the Israelites by the Egyptians during their departure, serve as a reminder of God's provision and the fulfillment of his promises. Every item in the tabernacle is crafted with purpose and precision, reflecting the holiness of the God it represents. The Ark of the Covenant, placed in the most holy place, is the central focus of the tabernacle. This sacred chest, overlaid with gold and adorned with cherubim, holds the stone tablets of the law, signifying God's covenant with his people. The mercy seat atop the ark is where God's presence is said to dwell, a place of atonement and reconciliation. Other elements of the tabernacle, such as the table of showbread, the golden lampstand, and the altar of incense, each carry profound symbolic meaning. The table of showbread, with its 12 loaves, represents God's provision for the 12 tribes of Israel. The golden lampstand, with its 7 branches, symbolizes God's light and guidance, illuminating the sacred space. The altar of incense, continually burning, represents the prayers of the people rising to God. Together, these elements create a space where worship is both reverent and relational, emphasizing God's holiness and his desire for communion with his people. The outer court of the tabernacle features the bronze altar, where sacrifices are made, and the basin for ceremonial washing. These elements underscore the necessity of purification and atonement before approaching God. The sacrificial system instituted here serves as a vivid reminder of the cost of sin and the grace of God in providing a means for forgiveness. The entire structure of the tabernacle, from the outer court to the innermost holy of holies, reflects a progression of increasing holiness, reminding the Israelites of the reverence required in approaching their God. The tabernacle is more than a place of worship, it is a mobile sanctuary that travels with the Israelites throughout their journey in the wilderness. This portability symbolizes God's presence not being confined to one location, but moving with his people wherever they go. The cloud by day and the fire by night, visible above the tabernacle, serve as constant reminders of God's guidance and protection. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out, but if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. Exodus 40 verses 36 to 37. This visual manifestation of God's presence reassures the Israelites that they are not alone, even in the harshest of environments. The construction of the tabernacle is a communal effort, involving contributions and craftsmanship from the entire Israelite community. Skilled artisans, empowered by the Spirit of God, meticulously create every detail according to the instructions given to Moses. This collective participation reflects the unity and devotion of the people as they dedicate their resources and talents to the worship of God. The completed tabernacle is consecrated with great solemnity, and the glory of the Lord fills the sanctuary, signifying his approval and presence. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Exodus 40 verse 34. The tabernacle's significance extends beyond its immediate purpose in the wilderness. It serves as a foreshadowing of the temple in Jerusalem, where God's presence would later dwell, and ultimately points to Jesus Christ, who is described in the New Testament as the ultimate fulfillment of God's presence among his people. The Gospel of John declares, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us," John 1 verse 14, using language that directly echoes the tabernacle. Through Christ, God's presence is no longer confined to a physical structure but becomes accessible to all who believe in him. For the Israelites, the tabernacle is a constant reminder of God's holiness, his provision, and his desire to dwell among his people. It establishes a pattern of worship that emphasizes both reverence and relationship, teaching the Israelites to approach God with awe and gratitude. For modern readers, the tabernacle offers profound insights into the nature of worship and the character of God. It reminds us that worship is not merely a ritual, but a response to God's presence and grace. It calls us to bring our best offerings, our time, resources, and devotion to honor the God who desires to dwell among his people. The story of the tabernacle concludes the book of Exodus on a note of divine fulfillment. God's presence, which led the Israelites out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, now dwells in their midst, guiding them toward the promised land. This powerful image of God's glory filling the tabernacle is a testament to his faithfulness, his holiness, and his unchanging desire to be with his people. As the Israelites journey forward, the tabernacle serves as a sacred reminder of their covenant relationship with God and the assurance that wherever they go, he will go with them. The book of Exodus is not just a historical record, it is a transformative narrative that speaks to the very heart of what it means to trust in God, experience his deliverance, and live in covenant with him. From the cries of the Israelites under Pharaoh's oppressive hand to the thundering revelation at Mount Sinai, and finally to the construction of the tabernacle, Exodus unfolds as a testament to God's power, justice, and unwavering faithfulness. This story reminds us that God is not distant or indifferent to human suffering. He hears the cries of his people and responds with acts of unimaginable power, as seen in the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. Yet his deliverance is not just about physical liberation, it is about transforming a broken and enslaved people into a holy nation. At Sinai, he gives the law, not as a burden, but as a guide to living a life that reflects his holiness. In the tabernacle, he demonstrates his desire to dwell among his people, offering them his presence as a source of guidance, protection, and comfort. For modern readers, Exodus serves as a reminder that the God who delivered Israel is the same God who delivers us today. He confronts the pharaohs in our lives, the fears, oppressions, and doubts that hold us captive, and calls us to step forward in faith. Like the Israelites, we are invited into a relationship with a God who not only saves, but also sanctifies, leading us on a journey toward spiritual maturity and ultimate freedom. The final image of Exodus, with God's glory filling the tabernacle, is a profound reminder of His abiding presence. It assures us that wherever we go, whatever challenges we face, God goes with us. The story of Exodus continues to echo across generations, calling us to trust in God's promises, follow His guidance, and live as people set apart for His purposes. It is not just the story of a nation, it is the story of all who seek deliverance, relationship, and the abiding presence of the living God.